This is a phenomenal book for parents, teachers, educators of any sort, extended family members, clinicians, anyone who needs to talk to children about illness, death, and loss of any sort. It is not particular to illness in a family. We at Courageous Parents Network are about illness in children and how it affects the family. So that is what we are going to be talking about tonight. Thank you for coming. The flow is going to be, I'm going to be asking questions of Elena, and she's going to answer, and we'll just move along. If you have questions that are particular to what you've just heard us talking about, please put your questions into the chat. I will see them. I will pause. I will ask Elena to answer them. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for just open-ended questions. There's nothing you cannot ask Elena. There's nothing you cannot express. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of this time that we have with Dr. Lister. All right, so without further ado, I will allow Elena to introduce herself just generally, and then we'll hop into it.
Oh, wow, that's a hard act to follow, Blythe. Yeah, I'm Elena Lister, and I come to this work. People often ask, so why did you write this book? And I come to this work because of my own personal experience. And we're now talking 28 years ago. My then younger daughter named Liza was diagnosed with leukemia. She had a sister, Molly, who was 7 at the time. So we had 4 and a 7-year-old. And Liza went through 2 years of chemotherapy, bone marrow transplants, relapse, more, and so on. The scene that many of you may be familiar with. And she died of her leukemia almost 2 years to the day after her diagnosis. And so I had a surviving sibling who at the time was 9 and was faced with not a book about it. More even than that, my husband and I, my husband's also an adult and child psychiatrist, we couldn't find people who could talk to us about it. Now, this was a long time ago. Unfortunately, things have changed, but we felt really alone and like we were every parent's worst nightmare, and nobody really wanted to get too close to what we were experiencing. And I had been already a therapist, and I taught at the hospitals, and I was doing writing about actually analytic writing. And it just seemed clear to me that I had to make use of our experience in some good way. My daughter who died wished that she could help sick children. So as I think about it, I carry on for her since she cannot. And I completely changed my career trajectory, basically. And I've been working with illness, death, and loss basically ever since. I work with other issues, any life challenges, but this is the focus of what I do. And it is some very deeply, personally, and professionally meaningful work for me. So the book came out of that, out of people saying, do you have this written down any place? And no, I don't. And eventually it dawned on me with some prodding from friends that perhaps I could try to write a book. And being daunted by that prospect by myself, I enlisted a colleague who's also a friend, Michael, and we wrote it together. And it was a great experience. We started the book before COVID hit. So we were grieving with the country, with the world, for what was happening to the world while we were writing this. We did not write it because of COVID, but it certainly was relevant to what we were experiencing at the time. I think that says it all. Blythe, have I left anything out?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Elena, I will say this, the topic of siblings is perhaps one of the the thing that we hear most from parents, one of the top concerns that parents have when we talk to them or when we do events, anything related to siblings, is of in high need, clearly. And so this book is a gift to parents and your expertise. And we did a video interview with you on CPN, so those will be there ever after, making your expertise available in that capacity on CPN. But siblings we're going to spend most of our time talking about siblings. I do want to ask, do you also work with the child when a child themselves is sick? Do you work with those children as well? Can you just let our audience know that?
Yes, I do. I've been at the bedside. I will go to a hospital and see someone or visit them in their home if they're too ill to maybe even participate in Zoom. And some kids are young and the Zoom thing doesn't quite work. I am, the wrong word, comfortable, but what I mean, I think, is that I'm able to sit there and be with a dying child. When my daughter was 5 3/4, Liza, with leukemia, we were told that she was terminally ill. And because of who she was and because of who we were as a family, we made the decision to confirm when Liza asked us, am I going to die from my leukemia? And so we lived for 3 months with her, knowing that she was dying, with her sister who was going on 9, knowing that her younger sister was dying. We lived at that time together, and I found it exquisitely agonizing and exquisitely beautiful. And that beautiful part of it is the part that I want to bring to being with children who are ill when they're ill. Mm-hmm. So I do that work, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk first about how to talk to the siblings when their brother or sister has been given a bad diagnosis with a poor prognosis. How to share that news with the siblings. And if you would be so kind as to, wherever possible, put in some of your, meaty, memorable headlines, like what is mentionable is manageable. That sort of
thing. We wanted this book to be really accessible, and also to kind of have a reader have the feeling that we were a companion with you in the room facing this stuff, because it is so hard. So we made these things which we decided to call best practices, and basically Blythe just indicated sort of one of them, which so we tried to sort of condense things into a few basic concepts. So if you're going to have a conversation with a sibling, there are a lot of questions that come up. Should the sibling who's ill be there? Depending on the sibling, depending on the age, and so on. Who else should be with you? How do you introduce it? What do you actually say? How do you answer the questions they may ask? And I have all sorts of thoughts about that. But first and foremost, before you do any kind of conversation with a child, I want to recommend that you check in with yourself. So one of the first things we say is know yourself, because if you are a parent facing this kind of conversation, you are in agony of some sort, overwhelmed, maybe numb, maybe terribly sad, panicky, all sorts of feelings. And although I believe that it's important to show your children emotion and to not be, wall about it, I also think it's important to have your own emotions be at least somewhat controlled when you're talking with a child. So I would say check in with yourself, even if the news you have to deliver needs to be delivered soon, because that can sometimes happen. I would say give yourself just a few minutes to ask yourself, how am I feeling about this? And tell yourself how you're feeling about it. Or if you have someone that you can talk to about it, ask each other about it. What am I worried about in talking with a sibling? What are you imagining? Who is my child sibling who I'm going to be talking to? Because that's another one of our ideas, know your child. Because children need things in different ways. So I might say deliver the news in one way for one kind of child and deliver it differently for another kind of child. And then, of course, after all that thought you put in, I would say expect the unexpected, which is if you're the parent of an ill child, you've already had that experience to expect the unexpected. But children can react atypically. So all that's kind of even before you walk in the room. But I also want to say that we believe in being honest. And I don't know how many of you have watched shows like Law and Order. I'm embarrassed to say how much time I've spent watching crime dramas and so on. But when you get into court, you say you would tell the truth, nothing but the truth. So we've modified that a little bit. We say, tell the truth, nothing but the truth, but not necessarily the whole truth, at least not all at once. I believe that if you lie to children, it comes back and they will have more difficulty trusting you. It was part of how we did it. It worked for us, but also I think in general, as you were saying, Blythe, what is mentionable is manageable. If you bring it forward, even if it's the hardest truth you could possibly imagine telling your child, it is better that it can be talked about, because if you can talk about it, you can deal with it. And kids are really keen observers. And even if you think you're doing like a mask and you're not showing that you just heard terrible news and you're being smiley and all of that, kids pick up that something's different. And they imagine all sorts of things. And even though what you may have to say may feel dreadful, they may be imagining something worse. So actually telling them what's going on is anxiety relieving in a way. Okay, now we're all in this together. We know the same thing, all of us, and we're going to deal with this together. And whatever happens, we are going to be in it together the whole time. And so that's a lot of preamble, but basically that is how we think about things. It's very hard to tell a child the truth about this kind of stuff, but I'll tell you there's a wonderful book I told Blythe about once. It's called Armfuls of Time, and it's out of print, but if anybody ever wants to find it, you can let Blythe know and I'll see if I can get you a copy.
I have a copy too.
Okay. And it's somebody writing about children who are dying and interviewing them. And what they find is that the children who are dying often know that they are, even if parents are not telling them. And they will say things like, I know that I'm dying, but my mommy and daddy, or my mommy or my grandma, whoever it is, they're not telling me, they're not talking about it. So they're probably too upset. I won't talk with them about it. Variations on that. And I think that I would hope to convey to a child that they don't have to be alone with that they do pick up on something being different, and both the sibling and an ill child. And if you don't talk with them about it, they're going to be thinking about it anyway. This way they can think about it with you and they can ask you their questions. And that's sort of like the way that we go into it, that you want to go in with an effort to be honest, to be emotionally present, to be as grounded as you can be, and to be prepared for whatever happens next in the conversation. I could go on more, Blythe. Should I go on more, or you want me to?
Well, no, so when you talk about, go in prepared, because hopefully you're not literally going in 10 minutes after you've gotten bad news, right? I remember in my case, we got bad news and we spent about 3 days collecting ourselves before we told our older daughter, who was only 2.5 at the time, something. We called in the cavalry professional counsel to figure out what to tell her. But you have some as part of preparing, you, Elena, have some ideas, prepare for some of the questions that children may ask. And I think we're particularly talking about children who are younger, right? Not like the 18-year-old sibling, but the younger siblings who have a different understanding of illness and trajectories and why bad things can happen to good people, things like that. So could you, and I think maybe you have this in front of you, talk about what are some of the questions that children are likely to ask that we can be prepared for?
Yeah, sure. So first, I think I'll add in that this is a conversation that if you can, you'd like to do not alone. Because that way, if you are overcome emotionally, there's another adult in the room who might be able to sort of take their turn saying something. And or if they're upset in a way that makes it hard for them to talk, then you might be able to take for them. So that's one thing, if you can, and that may be a luxury. But ideally, you have this conversation not before bedtime, because all of us feel more alone at night. When you're 2 and 3 and 4, of course, but I'm going to be 65 next month, and I feel alone at night more too anyway, and everything always seems worse at night. So you want to do it so that there's plenty of time before bedtime, if you can, so that you can be with your child while they're awake, while you're awake, and sort out things and give them time for questions. And, these days, everybody's on some sort of electronic most of the time, even while they're talking. My son and his friends come over and they were watching football, and they're all on their phones in a room full of being with each other while they're watching football, watching 3 games simultaneously. So we're used to multiple inputs, but I would suggest this is a screen-free moment. So everybody put away whatever screens they've got. And the idea is to try to promote eye contact with your child. So if you have a young child, you could sit on the floor. Some children like to be held and for conversation. Other kids like not at all to be held. So that's where you sort of know your child, but be open for anything. Some kids like to be playing with something while you're telling them things that are hard, and that's okay too. But you want to set the stage as best you can so that there's no interferences other than what's the most important thing of the moment, which is this conversation. So I think I can give you a little intro, because a sort of general intro. So what do you do? Then how do you actually sit down? And many of you may have already done this. Basically, to sit down and say, we have some really sad, hard news to talk about. We gathered everybody, and let's give a sibling a name of some sort. We'll say Jane. Jane has a sickness, and it's a big sickness. Depending, now again, I'm talking with younger, we could change it for a child who's a little bit older, has a big sickness, and they've been giving her medicines, as you know, but the medicines aren't working. And so we're here to talk about what that means, and we're going to have a bunch of time together. And then you pause, and all of us are really uncomfortable with silences. And you don't want to leave a child with silence for too long. But I mean, that's a lot to take in. And I just think just like a few seconds of, okay, let's catch our breath and see where we are, to see whether immediately there's a question, or one child bursts into tears, or another one runs out of the room, or somebody grabs a truck and throws it at the wall. Whatever is going to happen, you just give it a few seconds to kind of evolve. And then you can say more, and we could sort of go through different kinds of illnesses or whatever, but common questions. When are they going to die? Right? Because we all can't stand the uncertainty. And it may not be known. In our case, it wasn't known, although we were told anywhere from 2 weeks to a year. No, very, very, very unlikely a year. So what do I tell my older daughter? 2 weeks to a year, that's a long time for an 8.5-year-old to try to process. So I think, this is another one of those moments of truth. We don't know. We wish we knew. It'd be a lot easier if we did. But what we learn, and as we see what's happening, we will keep telling you what's going on. And so we're going to have to be in this not knowing together. And I mean, that is what it is. Another question. Yes.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
Do you think it's necessary to talk about the prognosis if it's not going to play out for a few years? Like I'm just being very self-referential. My
Right.
daughter, we knew that at least it was going to be, let's say, at least over a year. And her sister was only 2. So we were like, we were advised to not tell her that her sister was going to die, but rather, what were the things that she would be most curious about? Walking, talking, things like that. But she wasn't ever going to walk or talk, is what we told her. But so we didn't talk about the dying part early on because to your point, the sense of time was so long.
I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that. And that's where the tell the truth, nothing but the truth, but not necessarily the whole truth, at least not all at once, comes in. Because if it's going to be more than a few weeks to a few months, again, sort of depending on the age of the child, I think you say they've got the sickness. Let's say you're going to start with that. But let's say the sibling already knows. You'd say, so, Jane isn't doing that well with the medicines. She's having a really hard time. They're not working as well as they did before, and she's feeling more sick. And then that could be, yes, she isn't, has no energy to play. She won't be going to school, and very concrete things that a child can understand. What does that mean, actually? And not to say that she's going to die, even if you know it, because that is too far away. But as it gets more imminent, I think you continue to sort of feed bits of information. She's even sicker. We're not sure any medicines are going to be able to work. And then we know now that the medicines aren't going to be able to work. And so it's a gradual process, kind of the way it is for you as a parent. You know it. I mean, when my daughter was diagnosed, she had a 90% cure rate. We were going for cure, and clearly that's not where we ended up. But we did know with what turned out to be 3 months of life that she was going to die, that there was no hope for any further treatment. And so it was at that point that we told her sister. But I think if you're sensing that a child is going to ask that question, because that's another question to come up. So, well, is she going to die from it? Let's say you haven't said that. I think at that point, if it's still pretty far away, you could say, we don't know. We hope not, but we'll have to see, because you don't want to lie and say, no, even though you know. And as all of us, I mean, there are things that we don't know. So I think that's a fair statement at that point. But then when it's very clear, then I think you do have to, yes, she is going to die from her illness. Another question, are you going to die too? This is from a child to the parent, because a loss for a sibling of their parent is in some ways an even more traumatic, dramatic, feared thing So it's a common question. And if a child, I mean, I might know that because my daughter had leukemia did not mean that I was going to die of leukemia, but her sister would have no way of knowing that. So I think the answer to that, again, are you going to die too? Well, I mean, we all know at some point we're going to die. And I don't think you can say, no, I'm not going to die. But I think you can say, as best this can be true, I work very hard to be as healthy as I can. And I'm doing all the things that doctors tell me to be as strong, as healthy as I can. And I expect to live a long, long time. And I think that's fair. Now, a persistent child will say, okay, basically, okay, that's fine, but you didn't really answer my question, did you? So like, okay, but are you going to die? And at that point, your child is showing you they need to know. And I think an answer to that could be, and again, I'm always happy to play around with these things. An answer to that could be, at some point, I will die, but it's going to be when you're much, much older, and you're going to be ready, and you're not going to be alone. Mm-hmm. And that's ideally true. It could be true. And it's close enough to, it is the truth that yes, you are going to die, but the reassuring part is what you're offering, which is that imagining it now, projecting ahead for a child, the idea that they won't be alone and they'll be ready is reassuring. So that's a way to answer a persistent question. What's another one? Well, I get the sickness too. And that depends on what the sickness is. But you can say, you know, if not, no, you will not get this sickness, or you don't have this sickness. And then another one, why didn't I get it? Why did Jane get it and not me? And by the way, if anyone has a family member whose name is Jane, I'm sorry, but this is just an easier way, because otherwise it's too many words to explain. Why not me? And there's a lot of things you can answer to that. If you believe religiously, you might invoke, say, well, this was God's plan. If that's not something you could say, no one in science knows why you got this and why Jane got this and you didn't. We can't know that. But it isn't, and this is what's most important, it isn't because Jane was bad in any way, or that you should feel in any way badly, that you're okay. We celebrate that you're well, and we're sad that Jane is sick. Because kids who are siblings to a child who is sick feel often guilty that, you know, they want the attention. And they're glad they're well and can go do the other stuff that their sibling can't do. But that feels bad. And you want to reassure your sibling that that's natural. And that's what you need to do. You need to go live your life and do things and enjoy yourself. And, you know, we're going to be here together, and we're going to do loving things with Jane. And also, you go to school and you do your stuff and you have play dates and you go to the movies and whatever else, because that's one of the things that's part of your life. So I'm trying to think what other kind of questions might come up, Blythe.
Well, I think that's a good sampling of the types of questions that children are apt to have, or certainly earlier. What do you do, Elena, if you the child is now in possession of the sibling the sibling or the child who has the illness, and they're not talking about it. How often, I don't know how likely that is, but should parents be checking in with their child's feelings, their child's thoughts? Should they be inquiring, poking, wondering? Of course they're wondering, but how actively should they be inviting the either the child who is sick or the siblings to talk about it?
It's a really great question, Blake. I mean, I'm a big believer in talking, obviously, and I think that we connect via talking. At least that's one of the ways we connect. And that an antidote to fear is connection. So it is, I think, overall better for either the old child or their sibling to be talking about it. But there are a lot of ways other than talking about it that kids can express emotion, that we all can express emotion, actually. So I can get to those in a minute. But if your child is not showing any kind of expression of emotion about what's going on, and they're behaving normally, their teacher would have no idea that anything was happening at home, I think you walk gently, and I think that you check in, and I'll say something like, look, I'm a mom. We moms check in all the time with our kids, so I'm going to ask you every once in a while, how you doing with this? And so you kind of you make it more like that's what moms do, as opposed to probing. And it could be dad, grandma, any caretaker, teacher. I do think you want to be gentle about it, because some kids are ready to talk and some are not. But if they're not talking at all, and there's really a big thing going on in the family, I'd suggest offering other methods of communication. In the book, we have a lot of stories of our clinical experiences, but like everything is made anonymous. So the names, the ages, the genders, everything is all changed. But I would say one story we have is a dad and his wife had died, and the little girl was not, their daughter was not talking about it at all. And so I sat with him and I said, well, what does she like to do? And she likes to draw. So we talked about a way that he might be able to open up the conversation, and he got out on the table crayons and markers and paper and said, I feel like drawing. I'm going to draw. And you're not saying come draw with me per se, but most kids would join in on that kind of thing. And the father chose to draw like a lot of gray, and like big splotches of gray and dark. And he sort of narrated as he was talking, I chose this color because this is kind of how I'm feeling. I'm feeling kind of gray. And eventually that led not to his daughter talking about her feelings, but about the picture that she was making. Here's a picture of a flower. The flower is crying. So that begins it. Some kids use music. You can be really angry when your sibling or ill yourself that this is happening, and they need to bang it out a bit. So that to me is an expression of emotion, even without the conversation. And most importantly, that you, adult, are present for it. You're there and you're observing, you're with them emotionally. And so even though it's non-verbal, there is a connection that's happening. I love teenagers, by the way, I work with teenagers also. That's even dicier. Sometimes you can text to your child, or, basically, in my experience, teenagers can be very, very prone to talking at about 2 a.m. So if you've got the energy and they're up, and studying or something, wander into the room and plop down and say, hey, you want to take a break for a few minutes or something. So, again, it depends on the child and the age.
I really, one of the things you really emphasize is the importance of connection and being available for the connection, and communication is a form of connection. And your point is you can communicate in other ways that don't involve talking, art therapy, music therapy, that's between you and your child. It can also be, but you can bring in the child life therapist or the music therapist to help elicit that. There's so much more we could talk about that, but I want to make sure we get to everything, or as much as possible. School, classmates. So for school age children, for siblings of school age, for the siblings or the child, him or herself, who has classmates, what counsel do you have for how to talk to the administrators, the teacher, the classmates? And we do have a few pros on the phone. I'm seeing on the Zoom, I'm seeing Amy Graver, who's a mom here, who had to do this and did this exquisitely with her daughters. I think it was fourth grade. Was it, Amy, fourth grade or second grade?
Second grade when she got diagnosed, in fourth grade when she died.
So Amy, Amy is like, has spoken a lot about that, but for everybody else, I would love for your counsel on talking to the classmates, talking to the teachers.
And yeah, I welcome input from Amy also, if you want, but we had to do this actually when my daughter was ill. And it was one of the things that demonstrated for me that although I thought my daughters were, the most special things on earth, that in fact, what we were doing with them, talking about Liza dying, and was possible with many children. And so we decided, and that this is something I want to urge you to think about, to keep the school very, very informed, because we wanted the school my daughter, the sibling, my daughter who was ill, was too ill to go to school. So that was not a consideration. But for her sibling, we felt, and this I believe is important, that she was going off for the day for 8 hours or so every day, 5 days a week, that be a place where they were aware of what she was experiencing so that they could receive her compassionately. And maybe she's not as attentive in class. She's looking around and twiddling her thumbs, and that's not who she was before. Well, okay, maybe if they get why, they can be gentler about it. We actually then decided that I'll backtrack a bit. It is very difficult for young kids, and I mean 8, 9, 10, to talk to their friends about what's happening. How do you describe to your friends? And also for their friends to know how to respond. And this is where I really feel we have so much work to do to be able to teach kids how to talk with each other about death and loss, so that they grow up to be, caretakers in whatever form, who are able to talk about it with each other and with the children that they may be taking care of, because it's a real conversation stopper. I've had that experience myself plenty of times, as I'm sure many of you have. But so we wanted, and we advocate that you help your siblings, classmates, understand what's going on. And there are a few ways to do this. I can tell you what we did, but there are a lot of different ways to do it. One way is to write a letter to the class parents. Now, this is maybe not necessarily if your child is ill, but if you know that your child is terminally ill, and there will be some period of time when this is impacting, and maybe play dates are not as possible, and things are going to be very different. It's helpful for the other parents to understand, besides maybe the circle of parents who might know already. And so we did that. We wrote a letter to my daughter's third grade class with the permission of the school. And then we went in actually and met with all the third graders, 120 of them. And I have to say, it made my ill daughter furious that we did this. And this is another important point. It was disturbing because she's dying and she's really mad. We're violating her in some way. And it was very hard to take. But what we said to her, and what I believe is true, is, this is happening to your sister too. And we have to take care of her also. So even though you don't like this one, she needs help at school. And eventually she never liked it, but she tolerated it. And so we went and explained what was going on. And in that classroom, 120 kids, immediately kids began to raise their hand and talk about, my grandpa died, or I almost drowned in the ocean, or all sorts of things. They just were ready to talk about it all. And some really beautiful questions. One asked, what does Liza, my daughter who was ill, what does Liza do all day? What does she like to eat? They were trying to grasp what her experience was. It was very moving. And my older daughter, Molly, was present, but she didn't want to be up in the front of the room with us, which I understood. She was sitting in the back, looking sort of sad and scared and brave. And I saw two of her friends put their arms around her. And I thought, okay, we've accomplished what we wanted to accomplish. And it did get different after that. People were less freaked out about us. And we told the parents we were going to do this. We were going to talk to their children. And if they had concerns about that, to please contact the school and we would deal with that. So that's one way to help the classmates understand, to help the parents understand. I would suggest, if you can, meeting with the teacher and having a conversation in which you explain what the sibling is going through, what's happening at home, perhaps who might or might not be as available to go over homework, or what you wish the school would do, what kind of outreach. And in particular, to ask the sibling, do you want your teacher to talk about it with you or not? Because a lot of kids don't want to be different for this reason. And other kids feel like, I want everybody to know. So you can ask your child, do you want your teacher to ask you how you're doing or not? And I also would recommend building in a check-in with the teacher, like every week or so, depending on the speed of course of illness for your child who's dying, so that there's a built-in communication, because as a parent with an ill child and a sibling, you are incredibly busy. And the days get filled with all sorts of horrible and joyful things. And to have that built-in moment when you're going to connect with your child's school Fridays at 3, if other things happen and you may not be able to, but that's the plan, and the teacher is on board. That's the plan, and it can always be changed, but that's the goal. And then you get a sense of how your child is doing when they're not with you, which is really important. And then when the child dies, there's all sorts of things to do for a sibling at school. I don't know if you want me to get into that now.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, and I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I do, just quickly as a matter of admin sort of, Elena, are you able to stay a little past the top of the hour? Can you stay a little bit past? Okay, so we will go over a little bit, but for those who can stay on, so I might push in before we push a little longer before we open up for questions. Let's talk about towards the end of life, when the what do you recommend about whether, well, parents often wonder, should I let the other children see my child who's at end of life, who's dying? Should I let my other children see her? One, and it's, I mean, this is very difficult for some people to hear, and I will understand if I'm sorry if some of you just, this is too difficult, but see your child dying, should the sibling come visit in the hospital? In my case, my daughter was dying at home. Should her 4-year-old sister come in and say, be with her? Like, what do you recommend? And then also being with the child with the body after the child has died. Is there a recommendation, or is it to each his or her own?
It's a little bit of both. One of the things I am not as dogmatic about these things, because it's so individual, and you do want to really be in tune with a particular person, particular family. But that's where the check-in with yourself is really crucial. Can you bear it to be present for the sibling and the ill child at that time. Because if you, parent, can't do that, that's okay, but good to know. And some siblings want to go visit. So let's say you as a parent think, I just couldn't, it would break my heart to see the two of them together. Then maybe there's somebody else who could take the sibling who wants to go. I would never force it, but I would advocate trying as best one can to have some kind of contact between the sibling and a dying child before the dying child dies. And I think there's the reason why that book Armfuls of Time is called Armfuls of Time is because of this precious window you may have if you're able to know that your child is going to die. And that's a time when a sibling can have a moment to express feelings toward their sibling who's dying, and you can facilitate this if you can bear it. Maybe to give a parting gift, to talk about how much they're going to miss them, to play with them and have an ill child feel a little more like a kid for a little bit because they can sort of play with the sibling, whatever the ill child's able to do. And so if your child, sibling, feels like, I don't want to go, I don't want to see them in the hospital, I wouldn't force it. But to me, that's the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. And in which case you could say, okay, so you don't have to go, but let's think about why going seems hard. Mm-hmm. And let's think if there's any way we could make it easier for you to do it. And then some children will say, I don't want to see, or I'm afraid she'll cry, or, whatever the concerns are, you might be able to address them enough that the sibling will feel, okay, I can do that. In my experience, working with families for now 26 years, most siblings who have done it are glad they did. Mm-hmm. And siblings who haven't done it may appreciate why they couldn't at the time, but in retrospect feel like there was an opportunity there that they may have missed. And that's okay. But if you can facilitate it, I think that's better. And sometimes that means, this is what we used to do with my kids. We brought projects to the hospital. Mm-hmm. So like we had making crystals, mm-hmm. and mostly my well child was doing it, but the ill child was there. And so it wasn't just sitting and looking at each other and like, what are we going to do? Or even watching TV. We had like things that we did so that the time was, occupied and directed, and we could make a visit short. And if you can have more than one adult when you do that, so that one adult can leave with the well child and the other adult can stay with the sick sibling, so that the child who's ill isn't left with that, and the child who's well has somebody who they trust, who they can leave the room with. I do believe that that's ideal if you can.
We've had a question in the chat about, and this has come up in one of the interviews we did with a family member. We can have these plans for if and when if it happens, and when it happens, this is our vision for how it will go. But often things don't go as we would like them to go. And certainly in some cases where there is no clear prognosis of what end of life, of how you'll know that end of life is coming. And there could be an unexpected cardiac event or unexpected pneumonia or seizure. Some of our children have severe seizure conditions. That pressure parents have to have it go beautifully when it can't necessarily go beautifully, and then how to help the siblings when it. Do you have any thoughts on that, Father?
I'm so glad that was asked, because it's probably more common that it doesn't go just the way you wanted it to. But there was somebody who said this, and I can't remember who. A death with dignity is a death in character, meaning that it doesn't have to be beautiful or perfect or, lovey-dovey. People are who they are. If you are who you are, then at that moment it's real. And I think real and authentic is pretty important. But let's say the sibling says, okay, I want to go to the hospital. And then they walk in the room and they can't stand it and they go running out and they feel terrible about it. And there goes that visit, and the Crystal Project is clearly not happening, and all of that. And I think that what you can say to the sibling is, that happens and it's okay. It's okay, because we can't always have things go the way we wanted them to. And that's, there's an effort that you put in, and that matters. And I know your heart was there, and that's what matters. And if you didn't say the things you wanted to say, that's okay. That really is okay, because we all can't do what we think, we intended to do. And if a child is dying at home, our daughter died at home in our arms, and we didn't know when or how, or was she going to go into a coma? Was she going to have status epilepticus, which is constant seizures? Like, what was it going to be? And I wasn't sure that those would be good things for Molly to witness. And so you have to kind of play it by ear a bit at a time when you're feeling extraordinarily vulnerable, and everybody else is feeling pretty raw and vulnerable too. But it's okay if it doesn't go just right. Mm-hmm. It's okay if you don't say things just right. I think a wonderful moment with a child can be when you say, you know what I talked with you about yesterday? I'm not really happy with how I described that to you. Let's talk about that again. And what's good to me about that is, one, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it right. You can even say something which you think is horrific in retrospect, but that's okay. You can revisit it. And two, it models for your child that they don't have to be perfect. They can say the wrong thing, and that's okay, because we'll work it through. So I think it is more common that things don't go the way you want it to than they do.
I am mindful of the time. We, Courageous Parents Network, did an interview with Elena, and we covered a lot of ground because we had more time. And those videos, we'll be sending up a follow-up email to all of you with a link so you can see all the videos. So we don't need to get to all of those things right now, because we've sort of in a different way got it up on the site. So if you all, I'm going to take, if people would put questions into the chat, and then we'll call on you if you have questions, or maybe just unmic yourself and ask the question. We don't have so many people that you can't do that. I'm going to unpin, remove spotlight from Elena, and does anybody want to just go for it? A short question.
Hey, Blythe, I have a question. Elena, I was wondering if you have any tips for siblings. So my child who died was a twin, and her older siblings and her twin are now, it's been about 4.5 years. And so as they reach new maturation cycles and new ages, they kind of process grief differently. Are there any tips for, as they kind of relive or not relive it, but hit kind of a new understanding with their age progression?
That is such a great question. And I think developmentally, kids are going to revisit their past. Like I've had a 6-year-old say, when I was little, that kind of thing. And I think if you lay the groundwork early on, that you are open to conversation about anything, including this, then when your child is going through it, when they're 10 and 15 and 20, they will come to you and they'll say, I was rethinking when my sister died or my brother died. And I didn't understand what happened here or why did this happen. And I think the more this is where you fill in the things that maybe they were too young to get at the time. Maybe even if you said them, but they didn't quite understand them. And as you're saying, they began to understand them as they get older. I think that's great when that happens. And also at landmark times in a sibling's life, my older daughter, when she got married, was heartbroken that her sister wasn't there, even though her sister had died, many years before, and relived the loss in that way. At each point of life, a sibling will say, my sister or brother could have been here for this. And at that point, they re-grieve, because you're kind of grieving all along, but it sort of intensifies again. And there's another level of goodbye and letting it be there and living with that. And I think it's a good moment also to pay tribute to the child who died. Mm-hmm. Maybe you have some sort of moment where a child who's now 15 comes to you and talks about their sibling who died when they were 6, and you say, well, you want to light a candle? We could do that, or something, whatever it is. So conversation and maybe some sort of recognition or observation of the moment, but mainly you want to welcome that they are interested and curious and want to understand themselves more and what happened more.
Thank you.
Elena, one of the questions there, we sort of had 2 questions on this. What to do when the death is sudden and unexpected? So.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the same things apply. So the general principles, I think, are the same. You may have a little bit less time to check in with yourself, but still 30 seconds is, I mean, even if you go into the bathroom for 30 seconds, then come out and talk about it. But there is no preparation. And at that point you sit down and you say, we've had a really, really sad thing happen. And we want to tell you about it. And then whatever that is, right away, as soon as you can, because that is such a big thing that a surviving child is going to know something is terribly wrong. And then there was no chance to have any kind of goodbye. I don't believe in closure, by the way. That's a whole conversation. But there can still be a goodbye, and there is no chance for any goodbye in that case, in which case you can help a child know that you can say goodbye after somebody dies, that you can process, who that person was to you after they die. And that this is something I deeply believe. People die, but love doesn't die. And that they will always have the love of their sibling who died for the rest of their lives. So the suddenness prevents some stuff, but you can still hold on to what that connection was.
Why the main heading, Giving Hope?
I have to say, when Blythe and I have talked in the past, Blythe said, hope. Oh God, everybody talks about hope. Why'd you put that in the title? And I understand.
Don't get me wrong. Hope is very important. We all need it a lot.
Right, exactly. But it's overused, and it begins to sound a little trite. But to me, it was crucial enough, and I couldn't come up with any other word that conveyed what I wanted it to convey, which is some sort of looking toward the future with a sense that you're going to be okay, and that there's the possibility of joy even after such a devastating thing happens. And it took me a while to figure out I could feel joy again. So, and then also, if you have a child who is dying for a while, you have the opportunity to say, hope still exists, but it may need to be redefined. So rather than hoping that your dying child is going to go to college in Colorado you hope that maybe they have a day with less pain.
Mhm.
So the idea is that there's always something that you can look toward that can be a bit of a light in a dark moment. And so that's what we, and also because if you had these conversations with siblings, they learn that they can handle hard stuff and that they don't have to be alone with hard stuff. And then if they can handle hard stuff, you can look forward to the future thinking, okay, there's hard stuff, but I've been through hard stuff and I got through that hard stuff okay. So you can be hopeful about the future, even though we know that bad things can happen again, because you've found a kind of resilience in yourself as a child learning to face stuff. I believe the best protection for children is not telling them things, it's telling them things and helping them learn how to adapt to harsh realities.
I found that one of the most powerful things reading it and then talking with you was the notion that not only are you doing this in the present moment, but you are building a foundation that will serve your child well for the rest of their lives as they continue to live on and life's complexities happen and they experience other losses as God willing they live into a robust old age. Losses are part of life, we know, and that the foundation is being laid in this extreme and tragic way that will serve them well later. I thought that was a really compelling piece of encouragement for doing this difficult work. Does anybody have one more question? We have time for one more question for Elena.
Yes, I mean, so to you, Dr. Elena Lister, I certainly have not thought of that the child. I mean, I refer to those who are below age 18 as child. For the child who is dying, he or she knows that he or she is dying regardless of whether or not his or her parents tell him or her that. And yet, when I come back to think of it, it does make sense. And what I would ask you in this case is if for the siblings of the child who are dying, is it also the case that regardless of whether the parents inform them of the sibling is dying, they know that the sibling is dying anyways?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think I would say almost always yes. And I say this because of working with siblings and hearing similar kinds of things. Mom isn't telling me about this or grandma isn't saying anything about it, but I know that my sister is dying. Everybody looks different, you know, they pick. So yes, and especially because in those kinds of circumstances, a sibling is going to be really vigilant. They're going to be watching and listening because they know that things are going on and that there are important things that are going on and scary things. So it's a really good point. I don't think I've ever spelled that out. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, definitely they know. They just sense it, you know? It's amazing.
Right.
Thanks.
Elena, Jessica, and then this will be the last question. Jessica asked about what about, you know, we have hope and we're for the children who are battling one thing after another and continuing to I don't love the word battle, but you know, they're continuing to overcome obstacle after obstacle. So the framework isn't one about terminal prognosis, but you know, your sibling or you are, you know, here's another obstacle and you're resilient and here we go. And look, you overcame that obstacle and now here's another one. And then, so you're not talking about prognosis because you don't need to, but then there is an obstacle that that does not get overcome and the child dies, but no one has been talking about the possibility that the child would die because that has not been the pattern of what's been happening. What then?
Yeah, gosh, thank you, Jessica. When my daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and she was saying, am I going to get better and so on, I said to her something which was true, is that I had a big sickness when I was young, when I was 12. And I had to take lots of medicines and I got better. And that's what's going to happen for you too, because it was 90% likely that it would happen at that time. And then, of course, for our daughter, it didn't turn out that way. It turned out the other way. And I think you can explain to a sibling that while we thought that this was going to be another obstacle that we could overcome, in fact, and then whatever happened, maybe medicine at this time in history can't fix this particular obstacle. They could fix this and they could fix that and they could work with this, but this is one that we didn't know was going to happen that they can't fix. My idea being that you want to convey that you didn't withhold anything, that this is a new situation. And unfortunately, things can go worse. So I think mainly, and also, I'm a psychiatrist, we're accused of this all the time, but asking questions. So, before you answer anything, you can always ask a child, well, so what makes you ask that? So maybe you check in with child, say, so how's this one sitting with you? This is pretty different, that kind of thing. Find out where they are about it before you pitch in. But I think most siblings would feel like, well, wait a minute, what happened? Things are supposed to get better. And then it's scarier because it didn't.
I want to thank Elena, please, on behalf of all of us at Courageous Parents Network, for your time, for offering your time to us tonight. Thank you for writing this book. You'll all be getting a follow-up email with links to where you can find the book, although that's not very hard. Where we found a source for where you can find Armful of Times, links to resources we have on Courageous Parents Network, including video interview and podcast with Elena. Anything else that we can think of that we think might be helpful, we'll pop into that email. And really, I want to acknowledge that this is a extremely difficult conversation. And Elena introduced me to the word, it's not a new word, but I heard it listening to her in a new way, tolerate, the word tolerate. And I want to acknowledge all of you for tolerating this conversation and these difficult notions, especially for those of you parents who are actively parenting children living with illness and their siblings. This is scary. And so thank you for tolerating it. I hope this has been helpful. I think Elena's book will be helpful. I hope all the stuff CPN has on siblings and supporting siblings before and after, I hope that is helpful. I know that will be helpful. We've heard it's helpful. Thank you for being here. And as always, we are here for you.